Hello everyone, and welcome back to Fledgling Vanity Project and show that hasn't quite worked out its aesthetic yet. You need this book in your life, and this week the book I will be talking about is Ian Dunt's book How to Be a Liberal. Now this is a bit of a change in pace really, because what I'm going to talk to you about is actually a love story. Now if that seems strange that it's a love story, well, it needn't be, because what Ian Dunt has done is write a book which is essentially a love story to the philosophy of liberalism, going back 400 years to the candlelit bedchamber of René Descartes and working all the way through to today and the headaches we're having around populism and the likes of Trump and Bolsonaro and Brexit. Dunt charts the whole history of liberalism through its exciting teenage years and its angsty youth to its bloated middle age and the kind of space we're at where it needs to reinvent itself around now. So for the uninitiated, it's worth pointing out what liberalism is, and as imagined by people like John Stuart Mill or Jeremy Bentham, if you think of liberalism as the branch of political philosophy which says the individual is the most important unit of measuring value in society. The rights of that individual need to be held up as more important than anything else, essentially. So that branch of thinking starts right the way back there with René Descartes in the candlelit bedchamber where he says, "I think, therefore I am." You may recognise that phrase from literally any philosophy lecture ever. Now, what that means is that I as an individual exist and everything else springs from that. So from there on, what Ian Dunt does in his book is tell the story of liberalism starting there and going on through the English radical tradition where English radicals cast off the shackles of sort of top-down royal dictatorial rules, and then you move on through to people like John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham talking again about the rights of the individual to do what they want with their own life, the right to things like speech and freedom of assembly and protection from arbitrary arrest. And you get this really exciting period where liberalism is this force that sets people free en masse from that kind of feudalist, nobility and aristocracy have all the power, down into a more egalitarian society. So liberalism in those days is the good guy, and it has its high point of being the good guy. More and more rights are associated with the individual. You go through, initially there are things like property rights, you have freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, like I've said. You then move forward into the work of the likes of John Maynard Keynes, where it becomes important that people have an element of economic liberty in order for them to live a life which is actually worth living. But the real heyday, or the real heyday of liberalism comes when it fights its two great enemies, fascism and communism. Now, if you're a student of World War II history, it can be easy to fall into the trap of assuming that the communists were on the side of the West and therefore it was fine. Well, no, not really. At their heart, what Ian Dunt does is pull together fascism and communism as being two branches of philosophy that essentially erase the individual. Communism thinks the class is more important and fascism thinks the leader and the race is more important, whereas liberalism again holds fast to the rights of the individual and says that is important. Now what Dunt does is set up liberalism as the defender during World War II and during the Cold War of the values that kind of all of us alive today in the West, even if we don't think about it, we live according to those and our lives are meaningfully better for it. But then as Dunt goes through, liberalism isn't always the good guy. There is this sense as you go through that enormous swathes of the population have been left out of the advances brought by liberalism. At the very first liberals, for example, they talk about who the citizens are. And it just so happens that the citizens, the only people who are deemed important to the original liberals are white men, which obviously excludes everyone who isn't a white guy. So liberalism has its own original sin, whereby it hasn't actually expanded freedom for everyone, it's just taken that freedom and awarded it to a slightly larger group of comfortably off white men. So liberalism still has this exercise in growing in maturity and expanding the reach of the people that it benefits from, which is still, let's face it, kind of where it's at today. And where Dunt heads towards the final conclusion, he's talking about liberalism having become bloated and kind of lazy, and there's no competition around anymore. You have this kind of Francis Fukuyama end of history. Liberalism doesn't know what to do anymore, and it ends up taking the sides of large banks in 2008, where you get this technocratic, no longer interested in the well-being of the people and more interested in the well-being of the banks type philosophy that sets in, which then brings us forward on to Trump and Brexit and Johnson and all of those kind of new villains entering the stage, when liberalism is at this kind of beaten down Batman, past its best, can he get back up and fight again type position, that we are where we are now. So the question that I always ask is, do you need this book in your life? Well, yeah, you definitely need Ian Dunt's How to Be a Liberal in your life. It's a love story, it's a treatise for liberals, and ultimately, if you consider yourself a liberal, or if you have progressive values, or if you believe in an egalitarian society, well, you won't get where you want to be unless you know where you came from, and that is very much what Ian Dunt describes, and the history that Ian Dunt puts into it in his excellent How to Be a Liberal. The penmanship is superb. It's just a really great book for anyone for anyone who believes that individual freedom is important. I would firmly recommend it, especially now. So pick up a copy and enjoy it. Looking forward to next week. I will be discussing Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything, which is a magnificent piece of work on the subject of climate change. If you'd like to stick around for that, then leave a like, subscribe, and I will see you next week, everyone. Thanks.